There we go. Now we have hit record.
So hello, everybody. I'm Andrew Wolvin. I'm a professor at the University of Maryland in College Park. And my research area and my teaching area both deal with listening behavior. And we also have with us.
Hello, everybody. My name is Annie Rappeport. I am a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Maryland College Park, where I study international education and policy with an emphasis on research related to how listening and memory fuel a path towards peace in Cambodia, but also other international contexts. And I've had the pleasure of working with Andy as a mentor over the last few years, ever since I met him in the listening scholarly community.
And it's fantastic that on our large campus, we have come together. And I've enjoyed working on several listening projects with Annie. And indeed, as we think about the world today and where we are, we very much need to step back and listen to each other. As we think about what COVID, we think about armed conflict, we think about political conflict, we think about climate change, there's economic fragility. I mean, all the issues that are confronting us certainly call for a strong listening base.
I fully agree with you, Andy. And I think that some of our projects that we've worked on reflect those needs. The two that come to mind most readily are our response in our worlds to the COVID-19 pandemic was to see how leadership across higher education, specifically in the state of Maryland, responded through listening so that they could serve the needs of not only one group at university, but as many of you well know, university is like a city. And so finding ways to meet the needs of students, of course, also faculty, staff, and truly the whole spectrum of people who make a university work. Everybody had different accessibility to safety, accessibility to stable income, and needs to be able to return to campus or to participate in a hybrid or virtual university life there for a couple of years. So I really enjoyed that project. Another project, Andy introduced me to a wonderful organization called New Story Leadership. And so Andy, would you like to say a little bit about them?
The New Story Leadership brings together some Israeli and Palestinian young leaders from their countries together every summer here in Washington, D.C., to share their stories and to talk about projects and so forth that could help to bring them together. And it has been in development and has continued for several years. And it's a fantastic opportunity for not only the people who come and are participants in it, but also for lots of people here in DC to interact with them. They go to Capitol Hill and talk with various Congress people on the Hill and go to various churches and other areas where they can interact with people. And it's fantastic. It's interesting as we talk about listening, in that one of the issues that we confront as listening scholars is to convince people that it is a very complex and a very central part of human behavior, in that it requires us to engage all of our senses. And so often people will think about listening as synonymous with hearing, and yet we think about how much all of the senses, particularly the visual channel, certainly do engage in the process of listening. And we also need to understand that people need to be able to commit to understanding where the other person is coming from as they are listening to them. Not necessarily to agree, but to understand the perspective that's being presented, which, given all of the conflicts that we're confronting today in the world, certainly is an important dimension. And then, of course, responding appropriately and to make sure that everyone understands that the listener has understood and is being responsive to what has been discussed.
Definitely. And something that we have been afforded the opportunity with our work to do in that vein is to listen to some wonderful people leading the way in response and helping others learn how to engage all their senses, how to think about listening with your whole body, with your whole attention, authentically, curiously. There's all these things. Once you start think about all the ways you can be a better listener, it can seem a little daunting until, like many things, you practice and practice. It can feel more natural and organic to you, but it is such a rewarding process. So it's wonderful when you're doing qualitative research is you're studying the topic of listening, but you're also practicing listening throughout. And some of the response, especially what really strikes me about the new story leadership piece, especially, is you're working with two groups that for hundreds of years, to some extent, there have been tensions, conflict. There have been two very separate and isolated narratives being told to the youth, being cultivated over the years. So you're trying to bridge through listening a division that has been strategically created so that there would not be a bridge there. So there could still be conflict there from varying agendas, but that there's still this force, this inner humanity within us all where we want to see peace and to see these Palestinian and Israeli youth coming together, realizing that they're going to be hearing things that are difficult to hear about their own communities, but are so necessary for any kind of positive future. And in a different kind of circumstance, when it's not necessarily a conflict or a historical conflict between two groups, but if you're looking at the pandemic, there's unknowns, there's threats to our health and safety, there's change happening rapidly, disruptions, and in the university life, that also creates this sense of almost panic. So the last thing that comes to people's minds sometimes is this pause, come back together as a community, listen to one another, because in the long run, that's going to get you to where you want to go faster than rapid um, interventions and decisions that do not listen to all the people that they're going to have a direct or indirect impact on. So that's really become apparent.
Indeed, the New Story leadership does provide a wonderful model for worldwide applications as we talk about coming together and creating a world that will listen to each other. And likewise, what we found in our campus efforts was when our new campus president came in, the first summer that he was in office, he developed a whole set of listening sessions so that various aspects of the campus, people who were very engaged in the different dimensions of the campus would come together and talk about issues and create strategic plans and so forth by, of course, listening very much to each other. Listening
Mhm.
and engagement is a model that I find to be very helpful as we think about the complexity of the process. I've done some work putting together the physiological as well as the psychological as well as the sociological dimensions of listening to come together so that effective listeners can communicate in dialogue with each other. And that's not something that's sometimes easily accomplished, and yet it is so very, very important to what we want to do if we want to create a world that does indeed listen.
Yes, yes. And could you touch a little bit more on like the application of the engagement theory?
Well, engagement theory was developed to understand computer behavior,
Huh.
and so it's interesting to apply it to human behavior from a listening perspective. But essentially, it's to uh, engage all of the different dimensions, the physiological, the psychological, the sociological, and the communication dimensions, so that you really are fully engaged, if you will, in the process and are taking it seriously. And
That's interesting.
it's a challenge, I think, for all of us as listening people, in that you often hear somebody say, "Oh, well, just listen," or
Mm.
"simply listen." And to me, that is like fingernail on chalkboard, in that it is so inappropriate a description, because there's nothing simple, there's nothing just about what we do effectively as listeners.
That is an excellent point. And whenever, and you may feel the same way, Andy, whenever I'm sitting down to have what we would call an interview, but I like to call them conversations with someone that we're working with in research, it it's all it's always funny to me how often my conversation may go 3-4 hours long and we don't even realize it. We get lost in it because we're not trying to be rigid. We're truly listening to each other, researcher and the participant, and we see it more as an equal relationship. It's not rigid, and before we know it, we're friends, actually, for better for worse, if I should say that, in research and academia. But that process, once it's complete, if I have an interview, I try not to put anything else in my schedule because I don't want to cut it off. I want to listen. And at the end of it, I am exhausted, beautiful, exhausted, happy, exhausted, fulfilled and rewarded, exhausted, but nonetheless exhausted. Because if you're fully present and engaged and listening and responding appropriately to the person that you're working with and seeking to understand and yada, 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 you're going to be tired at the end of that. And so it isn't simple, and it isn't, you can't just dismiss it as this thing that just happens without any paying any attention to it.
And fully engaged, we have to also set aside the phone. And so
Mhm.
frequently I see people in restaurants, for example, where they're really not listening to each other or communicating with each other. They're on their phones. And another challenge we have, of course, is that today we're having to wear masks to
Mhm.
manage the pandemic, and that cuts off all of the nonverbal visual cues that, again, provide an important basis for listening and understanding the other person. So it is
Definitely.
complex,
It
but it
is.
is central to what we do and how we need to come together in this world.
Yeah, it
And
really
so we
is.
should thank the Global Listening Center for
Mhm.
bringing us together and for having the opportunity to spread the word about effective listening across the world.
Yes, it's been a pleasure and honor. It's fun to see a festival like this taking shape and evolving. So I'm excited.